The morning of August 12th, 1721, broke cold and grey over the waters off Cape Hatteras, North Carolina. The Atlantic stretched endless and iron-coloured beneath a sky heavy with the promise of storm. HMS Relentless, a formidable Royal Navy frigate, cut through the swells with disciplined precision, her British flag snapping sharply in the salt-laden wind. Captain William Thornbury stood on the quarterdeck, his weathered hands clasped behind his back, his jaw set in the rigid determination that had earned him both respect and fear throughout His Majesty's fleet. At 43 years old, Thornbury embodied everything the Royal Navy valued: order, hierarchy, unwavering loyalty to the Crown. His world was built on absolute authority. Officers commanded, sailors obeyed, and the chain of command was as sacred as Scripture itself. For 3 months, Thornbury had pursued rumours of a pirate vessel operating along the colonial coast. The whispers spoke of a ship called the Libertas, a name that made Thornbury's lip curl with contempt. Liberty. As if such rabble understood the meaning of the word. To him, pirates were nothing more than sea vermin, men who had abandoned civilization for a life of chaos and savagery. They were thieves, murderers, deserters from proper naval service who chose greed over God and country. The lookout's cry shattered the morning stillness. "Sail ho! 3 points off the starboard bow!" Thornbury's telescope found the vessel immediately. Even at this distance, he recognized the signs. The ship sat low in the water, heavy with stolen cargo, her sails patched and mismatched, her hull scarred by countless engagements. But what caught his attention was her sluggish response to the wind. Something was wrong with her rigging. The chase lasted less than 2 hours. The Libertas tried to run, but her damaged mainmast couldn't carry enough sail. The Relentless closed the distance with the inevitability of judgment itself. When Thornbury's cannons roared across her bow, a warning shot that sent up a towering column of water, the pirate ship struck her colours without firing a single gun in response. Victory without bloodshed should have pleased Thornbury, but as his marines prepared to board, he felt only disgust. These pirates hadn't even fought. They were cowards as well as criminals. The boarding party returned within the hour, herding 43 bedraggled prisoners onto the Relentless's deck. Thornbury studied them with the detached interest of a naturalist examining specimens. They were younger than he expected. Most appeared to be in their 20s or early 30s. Their skin bore the deep tan of men who lived entirely beneath the sun. Some were missing fingers, others bore terrible scars. One man, barely 20 years old, walked with a crude wooden peg where his left leg should have been. What struck Thornbury most was their diversity. Among the captured crew were black men, mulattoes, a few who appeared to be indigenous Americans, several Scots and Irish, even 2 who looked Chinese. In His Majesty's Navy, such mixing of races would be unthinkable. Yet here they stood together, not segregated by rank or colour, but simply as captured men awaiting their fate. The pirate captain was brought forward, a tall, sun-darkened man of perhaps 35, with intelligent grey eyes and surprisingly steady hands. His name, the Marines reported, was Samuel Bellamy, though the crew called him Black Sam for the dark hair he wore tied back in a simple queue. Thornbury expected pleading or defiance or the crude belligerence he associated with criminals. Instead, Bellamy met his gaze with something that looked uncomfortably like calm dignity. "Secure them in the hold," Thornbury ordered, "and strip that pirate ship of anything valuable before we scuttle her." Lieutenant Richard Ashford, Thornbury's second-in-command, supervised the salvage operation personally. Ashford was 28, the third son of a minor nobleman, educated at Cambridge before purchasing his commission. Unlike his captain, Ashford possessed a curious mind, one that his rigid naval training had never quite suppressed. The Libertas was exactly what Ashford expected, a floating warehouse of plundered goods. Barrels of rum, bolts of stolen silk, Spanish silver coins, navigational instruments taken from captured merchants. The crew's quarters were cramped and dark, smelling of unwashed bodies and bilge water. But in the captain's cabin, Ashford found something that stopped him cold. On a small table, weighted down by a cracked teacup and illuminated by the grey light filtering through a salt-stained window, lay a document. The paper was good quality, too good for pirates, and covered in careful handwriting. At the top, in bold letters, were words that made Ashford's breath catch. Articles of the Libertas, a constitution for free men at sea. Below this title, 43 signatures sprawled across the bottom of the page, each man's mark witnessed by those beside him. Some signatures were elegant and educated, others were crude X marks, signed by men who couldn't write their own names, but every single member of the crew had signed. Ashford lifted the document with trembling hands and began to read. With each line, his understanding of everything he thought he knew about pirates began to crack and splinter. The opening declaration hit him like a physical blow. We, the crew of the Libertas, being free men who have cast off the chains of tyranny and exploitation, do establish this constitution to govern ourselves with justice, equality, and mutual respect. No man among us shall be master or slave, but all shall be brothers in liberty and shared fortune. It continued with articles so detailed, so methodical, so civilized, that Ashford found himself reading passages twice to believe his own eyes. Article 2 established democratic governance. The captain could be elected by majority vote and removed by the same process if he proved tyrannical or incompetent. Every man aboard had an equal voice in major decisions: where to sail, which ships to target, how to divide captured goods. Article 4 detailed compensation with mathematical precision. The captain received 2 shares of all plunder, the quartermaster 1.5 shares, skilled craftsmen like the carpenter and surgeon received 1.25 shares, and every other man received 1 full share. No exceptions based on race, origin, or previous station. Article 5 addressed injuries with stunning specificity. Loss of a right arm was compensated with 600 pieces of 8. Loss of a left arm, 500. Loss of a right leg, 500. Loss of a left leg, 400. Loss of an eye, 100. Men too injured to continue active service were to receive retirement shares and be set ashore in a port of their choosing with enough money to live modestly. Article 7 established strict prohibitions. No man could strike another in anger without facing punishment. No man could force himself upon a woman under penalty of death or marooning. No man could steal from his fellows. No man could hide captured goods for himself. Article 9 created a system of trial by jury. 12 men chosen by lot from the crew would hear any disputes and vote on punishment. Ashford felt the deck sway beneath his feet, though the sea was calm. This wasn't possible. These were pirates, savage criminals who lived outside all law and order. Yet here, in his shaking hands, was a document that established justice, democracy, and human dignity more thoroughly than many nations he could name. His mind reeled with implications. In the British Navy, flogging was routine punishment for minor infractions. Officers wielded absolute power over common sailors, who had no voice, no rights, no recourse against abuse. Men were pressed into service against their will, torn from their families, and forced to serve for years in brutal conditions. And the idea that a black man or a Chinese sailor could receive equal treatment to a white Englishman was so absurd as to be laughable. Yet these pirates, these supposed savages, had created exactly that system, and they had done it decades before enlightened philosophers in London coffeehouses debated such radical ideas. Ashford rolled the document carefully and tucked it inside his coat. He needed to show this to Captain Thornbury, but as he climbed back aboard the Relentless, a cold certainty settled in his gut. His captain would not want to see this, would not allow himself to see it, because if pirates could govern themselves with more justice than the Royal Navy, What did that say about the empire they both served? The captured pirates remained in the hold for 2 days, while HMS Relentless turned south toward Port Royal, Jamaica, where they would face trial and almost certain execution. During those 2 days, Lieutenant Ashford found himself unable to think of anything except the document hidden in his sea chest. He had not yet shown it to Captain Thornbury. Every time he considered doing so, he imagined his captain's reaction, the immediate dismissal, the accusation that the document was obviously a fraud, perhaps even anger at Ashford for taking it seriously. Thornbury's worldview was rigid and uncomplicated. Officers were superior to sailors, Englishmen were superior to all other races, and His Majesty's Navy represented the pinnacle of civilization and order. This document threatened all of that. On the 3rd morning, Thornbury ordered the pirate captain brought to his cabin for interrogation. Ashford attended, as was proper for the ship's second officer. He positioned himself near the stern windows, trying to appear detached and professional, while his heart hammered against his ribs. Samuel Bellamy entered in chains, escorted by 2 Marines. In the confines of Thornbury's immaculate cabin, with its polished mahogany desk, its neat charts, its portrait of King George III, the pirate looked out of place and yet somehow unbowed. His dark hair was matted from days in the hold, his clothes filthy and torn, but his grey eyes remained clear and intelligent. Thornbury did not invite him to sit. Instead, the captain remained behind his desk, studying Bellamy as one might study an interesting insect. "Samuel Bellamy," Thornbury began, his voice cold and formal. "You stand accused of piracy, theft, and armed robbery on the high seas. These crimes carry a sentence of death by hanging. Do you have anything to say in your defense?" Bellamy met his gaze steadily. "I have nothing to say that you would hear, Captain. Your mind was made up about men like me, long before this ship caught mine." Thornbury's jaw tightened. "Men like you? You mean criminals, deserters, those who have abandoned all honor and decency?" "I mean free men," Bellamy replied quietly, "men who chose liberty over oppression." The word liberty, that same word from the ship's name, the same concept that saturated the captured document, struck Ashford like a bell. He saw his captain's knuckles whiten as Thornbury gripped the edge of his desk. "You speak of liberty while stealing from honest merchants," Thornbury said, his voice rising slightly. "You speak of freedom while terrorizing innocents. Your life is one of violence and chaos without law or order." Something flickered in Bellamy's eyes, not anger, but something closer to pity. "Without law," he said softly. "Captain, my ship had more law, more genuine justice than I ever witnessed in the Royal Navy. Every man aboard the Libertas chose to be there. Every man had a voice in our decisions. Every man received fair compensation for his labor and his risks. Can you say the same of your crew?" Ashford saw the color rise in Thornbury's face. The captain stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the deck. "How dare you compare your rabble to His Majesty's Navy? My men serve with honor under proper authority. They understand duty, discipline. They understand the lash," Bellamy interrupted, his voice still calm, but now edged with steel. "They understand being torn from their homes by press gangs. They understand watching officers grow rich while they receive barely enough to survive. They understand dying in battle to protect the wealth of men who view them as less than human." The cabin fell silent, except for the creak of timbers and the distant cry of gulls. Ashford could barely breathe. He had never heard anyone speak to Captain Thornbury this way. More shocking, he could find no argument against Bellamy's words. Thornbury's hand moved to his sword hilt, an unconscious gesture that revealed how deeply the pirate's words had struck. But he was too disciplined to draw the blade. Instead, he forced his voice back to icy control. "You will hang," he said flatly, "you and every man on your crew, and the world will be better for it." "Perhaps," Bellamy acknowledged, But the ideas we carried aboard the Libertas will not hang with us. You cannot execute an idea, Captain. You cannot put freedom on trial." Ashford saw his opportunity and seized it, pulling the rolled document from inside his coat before he could lose his nerve. "Captain Thornbury," he said, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart. "I found this aboard the pirate vessel. I believe you should see it." Thornbury turned, irritation flashing across his features. "What is it, Lieutenant?" "Their constitution, sir. Their written laws." The word constitution hung in the air like smoke. Thornbury's expression shifted through several emotions: confusion, disbelief, then something that looked uncomfortably like fear. He snatched the document from Ashford's hands and unrolled it on his desk. Ashford watched his captain read, seeing the man's face pale, then flush, then pale again. Thornbury's eyes moved rapidly across the text, his breathing growing shallow. When he finally looked up, his gaze fixed not on Bellamy, but on Ashford. "Where did you find this?" The question came out barely above a whisper. "In the captain's cabin, sir, on a table, as if it had been recently consulted." Thornbury's eyes returned to the document, scanning specific passages as if searching for proof of forgery. His finger traced over the 43 signatures at the bottom. "This is—" he began, then stopped, unable to finish the sentence. "It is genuine," Bellamy said quietly. "Every word, every signature. My crew lived by those articles. We chose them together, every man having equal say in their creation and amendment." Thornbury's hands were shaking now, a sight so unprecedented that Ashford felt his own certainty waver. His captain, the unflappable disciplinarian who had faced down Spanish galleons and Caribbean hurricanes without flinching, was trembling. "This is impossible," Thornbury said, though his voice carried no conviction. "Pirates cannot— You are criminals, deserters, the dregs of society. You cannot create something like this." "Why not?" Bellamy asked, and Ashford heard genuine curiosity in the question. "Because we are not English gentlemen, because some of my crew are black men, or Scots, or Chinese. Because we chose freedom over tyranny." Thornbury looked up sharply at that last word. "Tyranny! You dare call His Majesty's Navy tyrannical?" "I call any system tyrannical that treats men as property," Bellamy replied. "That gives absolute power to some and no voice to others. That values a man's rank over his humanity." He paused, then added softly, "Read your own Navy's regulations, Captain, and tell me which system truly values human dignity, yours or ours." The silence that followed was suffocating. Ashford watched emotions war across his captain's face: anger, confusion, and beneath it all, something that looked terribly like doubt. Finally, Thornbury rolled up the document with jerky, agitated movements and thrust it back at Ashford. "Return this pirate to the hold," he ordered the Marines, his voice rough. "This interrogation is finished." As Bellamy was led away, he turned back at the doorway and spoke once more, his words falling into the cabin like stones into still water. "Some day, Captain, the world will govern itself by principles like those you hold in contempt. Some day, common men will have voices and votes and dignity. And when that day comes, they will not remember the names of Navy captains who defended tyranny." He paused. "But they might remember pirates who dared to imagine something better." Then he was gone, leaving only the sound of chains dragging across the deck. Ashford and Thornbury stood in silence for a long moment. Finally, the captain sank into his chair, looking suddenly older than his 43 years. "Lieutenant," he said quietly, not meeting Ashford's eyes, "you will not speak of this document to anyone. That is an order." "Sir?" Ashford's surprise made the word come out too loud. "You heard me." Thornbury's jaw set in a hard line. "If word of this spreads, if our own crew begins asking why pirates govern themselves more justly than His Majesty governs his navy, it could undermine everything: discipline, order, the entire chain of command. It must be suppressed." Ashford felt something cold settle in his chest. "Sir, surely the Admiralty should know." The Admiralty will know that we captured a notorious pirate vessel and will deliver its crew for trial and execution." Thornbury interrupted sharply. "Nothing more. That document does not exist. Do you understand, Lieutenant?" It was not truly a question. It was a command from a superior officer to a subordinate, the very hierarchy that the pirate constitution challenged so fundamentally. "I understand, sir," Ashford heard himself say, though understanding and agreeing were very different things. That night, alone in his cramped cabin, Ashford unrolled the document once more and read it by candlelight. Each word felt heavier now, weighted with implications that made his chest tight and his thoughts spin. These pirates had created democracy at sea decades before most nations even seriously debated such ideas. They had established racial equality when slavery was not only legal, but considered economically necessary. They had rejected absolute authority in favor of voted leadership and trial by jury. And the British Empire, the greatest civilization in the world, or so Ashford had always been taught, wanted to bury this knowledge, wanted to pretend it didn't exist, wanted to hang these men and let their revolutionary ideas die with them. For the first time in his life, Lieutenant Richard Ashford began to question which side was truly civilized and which was savage. Port Royal, Jamaica, gleamed white and gold under the Caribbean sun as HMS Relentless entered the harbor on August 29, 1721. The port was a jewel of the British Empire, wealthy beyond measure from sugar plantations, worked by enslaved people, bustling with merchant vessels and naval ships, representing everything that British colonial power had built in the New World. Lieutenant Ashford stood at the rail, watching the island approach, the pirate constitution still hidden in his sea chest, burning in his thoughts like a secret fever. In the 2 weeks since the interrogation, he had observed Captain Thornbury carefully. His commanding officer had become withdrawn, distracted, prone to sudden outbursts of temper that were unlike his usual controlled demeanor. Twice, Ashford had caught him staring at the hold where the pirates were confined, his expression unreadable but troubled. The trial was scheduled to begin 3 days after their arrival. Vice Admiral Sir Thomas Walker, commander of the Caribbean station, would preside. Walker was 71 years old, a veteran of countless naval engagements, renowned for his uncompromising views on discipline and his complete contempt for pirates. Ashford had heard him speak once, years ago, describing pirates as a cancer on civilization that must be cut out and burned away without mercy or hesitation. The prospect of showing Walker the pirate constitution seemed both necessary and suicidal to Ashford's conscience. On the morning before the trial, Ashford made his decision. He requested a private audience with Captain Thornbury and was granted 15 minutes in his cabin aboard the Relentless. Thornbury looked exhausted. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his usually immaculate uniform showed signs of neglect. A button missing, a crease in the wrong place. When Ashford entered, his captain was staring out the stern windows at Port Royal's harbour, a glass of rum in his hand despite the early hour. "What is it, Lieutenant?" Thornbury's voice was flat, drained of its usual authority. Ashford drew a deep breath. "Sir, I believe we must present the pirate constitution to Admiral Walker before the trial." Thornbury turned slowly, his expression dangerous. "I gave you an order regarding that document." "Yes, sir, but suppressing it is wrong." The words came out stronger than Ashford intended. "That document proves these pirates established a system of governance that in many ways exceeds our own in justice and human dignity. Admiral Walker, the entire Admiralty, should know what we discovered." "And what exactly did we discover, Lieutenant?" Thornbury's voice was soft now, which somehow made it more threatening. "That pirates wrote down some pretty words about equality and democracy? That means nothing. They are still thieves and murderers." "Are they?" Ashford challenged, his careful respect for rank fraying. "The crew we captured hadn't killed anyone in their last 4 raids. They offered merchants the choice to surrender peacefully and harmed no one who complied. By their own constitution, they are forbidden from unnecessary violence." Can we say our pressing gangs show the same restraint? Thornbury's glass slammed down on the desk, hard enough to crack. You forget yourself, Lieutenant. Those men are pirates. They exist outside the law. The document you found is nothing but hypocrisy, words contradicted by their very existence. Or perhaps, Ashford said quietly, it is our existence that contradicts what we claim to stand for. We speak of civilization while enslaving an entire race. We speak of order while beating our own sailors bloody for minor infractions. We speak of justice while giving common men no voice in their own governance. He paused, gathering courage for what came next. The pirates wrote a constitution that is more enlightened than our own empire. That is what we discovered, sir. And that is what terrifies you. The silence that followed was absolute. Thornbury's face had gone pale, then flushed deep red. For a moment, Ashford thought his captain might strike him. Instead, Thornbury turned back to the window, his shoulders rigid with tension. "You are young, Lieutenant," he said finally, his voice carefully controlled. "You have not yet learned that the world cannot be governed by idealistic principles alone. Order requires hierarchy. Civilization requires that some men lead and others follow. Without that structure, there is only chaos." The Libertas was not chaos, Ashford countered. It was organized, disciplined, successful. And it was built on democratic principles that gave every man dignity and voice. "It was a pirate ship," Thornbury wheeled around, his composure finally shattering. "Built on stolen goods, manned by deserters and criminals. You cannot compare their perverted system to the majesty and tradition of His Majesty's Navy." But Ashford saw the desperation in his captain's eyes, heard the pleading beneath the anger. Thornbury was not trying to convince Ashford. He was trying to convince himself. "I am going to show the Constitution to Admiral Walker," Ashford said quietly. "With or without your permission, sir." Thornbury stared at him for a long moment, emotions warring across his weathered face, anger, fear, something that might have been respect, and beneath it all, a weariness that seemed to age him decades. "Then you are a fool," Thornbury said finally. "Walker will destroy you for this. He will see it as questioning the empire itself. Your career will be over before you are 30. "Perhaps," Ashford acknowledged, "but I will not bury the truth to protect my career. These men wrote something extraordinary, something that challenges everything we believe about who deserves freedom and dignity. If we execute them without the world knowing what they created, we are not serving justice. We are serving fear." The trial commenced the next morning in Port Royal's Admiralty Courthouse, a grand stone building that spoke of British permanence and power. Vice Admiral Walker presided from an elevated bench, his white wig and red robes adding to his already imposing presence. The courtroom was packed with naval officers, colonial officials, and wealthy plantation owners eager to see pirates brought to justice. The 43 members of the Libertas crew stood in chains before the court. Samuel Bellamy remained in front, his grey eyes calm despite the certain knowledge that he would be sentenced to death. Around him stood his crew, black men and white men, young and old, educated and illiterate, bound together by something more than chains. The charges were read: piracy, theft, robbery on the high seas. Captain Thornbury provided testimony about the capture. Everything proceeded exactly as expected in such trials, swift, efficient, predetermined. Until Lieutenant Richard Ashford stood and requested permission to present additional evidence. Admiral Walker frowned down at him, surprised. "What evidence, Lieutenant? The pirates were caught in possession of a vessel loaded with stolen goods. What more evidence is required?" "Evidence of their governance, sir." Ashford's voice rang clear in the hushed courtroom. "Evidence of how they conducted themselves and organized their society at sea." Walker's frown deepened. "Their society? Lieutenant, they are pirates, not a society." "With respect, sir, I disagree." Ashford stepped forward and placed the rolled Constitution on the clerk's table. This document was recovered from the captain's cabin of the pirate vessel. It is their Constitution, a detailed system of laws and democratic governance. The murmur that went through the courtroom was like wind through dry leaves. Admiral Walker leaned forward, his bushy white eyebrows drawing together. "A constitution? Let me see that." The clerk brought the document to Walker's bench. Ashford watched the Admiral unroll it, saw his eyes widen as he read the title, watched his expression shift from confusion to disbelief to something harder to define. The courtroom fell silent as Walker read. The minutes stretched out, marked only by the ticking of the court's clock and the distant sounds of the harbour outside. Ashford glanced at Captain Thornbury, who sat rigid in the witness box, his face unreadable. Finally, Walker looked up. His face had gone grey. "This is genuine?" he asked, his voice strained. "Yes, sir," Ashford replied. "Every signature has been verified. The crew lived by these articles." Walker read several passages aloud to the court. The democratic election of captains, the equal distribution of wealth, the compensation for injury, the prohibition against tyranny and abuse. With each word, the murmuring in the courtroom grew louder, more agitated. When he finished, Walker looked down at the pirates with an expression that mixed revulsion, confusion, and something that might have been fear. "You wrote this?" he asked Samuel Bellamy. "We wrote it together, sir," Bellamy replied quietly. "Every man had a voice in its creation. Every man signed it freely." "Impossible," Walker said. But the word lacked conviction. "You are criminals, outlaws. You cannot have created something like this." "And yet we did," Bellamy said, "because we understood something that you are only now beginning to grasp, that common men, given freedom and dignity, can govern themselves with justice. That democracy need not be reserved only for wealthy landowners and nobility. That a man's worth is not determined by his birth or his race, but by his character and his actions." The courtroom erupted. Naval officers shouted objections. Plantation owners rose from their seats in fury. To them, the suggestion that black men and white men could be equals was not just absurd, but dangerous, threatening the entire economic system built on slavery. Admiral Walker pounded his gavel repeatedly, calling for order. When silence finally returned, Walker's face had hardened into an expression of cold fury. "This changes nothing," he announced, his voice ringing with authority. "These men are pirates. They have stolen property and operated outside the law. Whatever document they have written, whatever system they claim to have followed, it is illegitimate. The law is clear. They will hang." But Ashford saw something in Walker's eyes, a flicker of uncertainty, of fear, that told him the truth. The Constitution had changed everything. It had revealed something the Empire could not afford to acknowledge, that its supposedly civilized system of governance was less just, less democratic, less humane than that of outlaws and criminals. The verdict was delivered within an hour. Guilty on all charges. Execution by hanging, to be carried out in 3 days. As the pirates were led from the courtroom, Samuel Bellamy turned and caught Ashford's eye. The pirate captain nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement and strangely gratitude. Then he was gone, chains dragging across the stone floor. That night, Lieutenant Ashford sat alone in his quarters, the pirate constitution spread before him once more. Outside, Port Royal celebrated the coming executions with drinking and revelry. Inside, Ashford felt only a crushing weight of understanding. The Empire would hang these men. It would destroy their ship, scatter their Constitution's words to the wind, but it could not destroy what those words represented, proof that democracy, equality, and human dignity were not dependent on empire or nobility or race, but were universal principles that any group of humans could embrace if they had the courage. Bellamy had been right. You could not execute an idea. And the idea that common men deserved freedom and justice that had been planted in Ashford's mind, and he suspected in others' minds as well, including, perhaps, in the troubled mind of Captain William Thornbury. History would record the execution of the Libertas crew as just another pirate trial. But Ashford knew the truth. What would die in 3 days was not an idea, but the Empire's comfortable certainty that it alone represented civilization. The executions were scheduled for dawn on September 4th, 1721, in Port Royal's public square. A crowd of hundreds had gathered: sailors, merchants, naval officers, plantation owners, enslaved people forced to attend as a lesson, children hoisted on parents' shoulders for a better view. Execution days were spectacles in the Caribbean colonies, combining entertainment with demonstration of British power. Lieutenant Richard Ashford stood among the naval officers, his uniform crisp in the early morning heat, his face carefully composed. Beside him, Captain Thornbury stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched so tightly that Ashford could see the muscle jumping beneath his weathered skin. The 43 pirates were led onto the scaffold in chains, their steps measured and steady despite what awaited them. They had been given the opportunity to recant, to beg for mercy, to condemn their pirate ways in exchange for possible clemency. Not one had taken it. Samuel Bellamy walked at the front of the line, his dark hair stirring in the morning breeze, his grey eyes scanning the crowd without fear or hope. When his gaze found Ashford, he offered a small, sad smile as if to say, "You tried. That matters." The charges were read again, loud enough for the crowd to hear. The word pirate was repeated like an incantation, meant to strip these men of their humanity, to transform them into monsters deserving of death. But Ashford, who had read their constitution, who had seen the care with which they governed themselves, who had spoken with their captain and heard the intelligence and conviction in his words, Ashford could no longer see monsters. He saw only men. Men who had dared to imagine a different world. The nooses were placed around their necks, 43 ropes, 43 men waiting for the same fate. In the crowd, some people cheered. Others were silent, perhaps made uncomfortable by the sheer scale of the execution, by the youth of some of the condemned. Admiral Walker stood to give the final order. But before he could speak, Samuel Bellamy's voice rang out across the square, clear and strong. "We die today, but the idea for which we lived will not die with us. Someday, common men will govern themselves with the dignity and justice we practiced at sea. Someday, democracy will not be reserved for the wealthy and the noble. Someday, a man's worth will be measured by his character, not his birth or his race. That day is coming, whether the Empire wills it or not." Walker's face flushed red with fury. "Silence that man!" he roared. But it was too late. The words had been spoken, and they spread through the crowd like ripples across water. Ashford saw heads turning, heard whispers starting. The enslaved people at the edge of the crowd stood a little straighter. The common sailors glanced at each other with expressions that mixed confusion and something that might have been awakening. The trap doors opened, 43 ropes snapped, taut. The sound was like distant thunder. Ashford closed his eyes, unable to watch. Beside him, he heard Captain Thornbury draw in a sharp, shuddering breath, a sound of pain that cut through the morning air. When Ashford finally opened his eyes again, the scaffold was a study in stillness. The crowd began to disperse, satisfied that British justice had been served. But Ashford noticed something. Many were leaving in silence, without the jovial relief that usually followed executions. Something had changed. Something in Bellamy's final words, or in the very fact that pirates had written a constitution, had planted seeds of doubt in minds that had never questioned before. That evening, Ashford found Captain Thornbury on the quarterdeck of the Relentless, preparing for their departure the next morning. The captain stood at the rail, staring out at the Caribbean sunset, a spectacular display of orange and gold that painted the harbour in colours too beautiful for the day's darkness. "Sir," Ashford said quietly, standing beside him, "permission to speak freely?" Thornbury was silent for a long moment, then, "Granted. What we witnessed today, what we destroyed, it will not be forgotten. That constitution represented something revolutionary: democratic governance, racial equality, human dignity for common men. Those ideas are already spreading in the American colonies, in Europe. Philosophers are writing about them. Common people are dreaming of them. Ashford paused, choosing his words carefully. We hanged 43 men, but we cannot hang what they proved. That such a system can work, that it can create justice and loyalty and brotherhood among men. Thornbury continued staring at the sunset. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. Do you know what terrifies me most, Lieutenant? Not that pirates wrote a constitution. Not that their system of governance was more just than our own. He turned to face Ashford, and in the fading light, his eyes glistened with something that might have been tears. What terrifies me is that I read that document, and I found myself wishing, for just a moment, that I could have lived under such a system. That I could have been part of a crew where my voice mattered, where I was valued as a human being rather than a rank, where justice was real, not just a word we used to justify hierarchy. Ashford stood speechless, stunned by his captain's confession. I have served the Royal Navy for 27 years, Thornbury continued. I have believed with every fibre of my being in order, hierarchy, the rightness of our system. And in one afternoon, reading the words of pirates, that certainty was shattered. He laughed bitterly. How does one live with that knowledge? How does one continue serving a system one knows is unjust? Perhaps, Ashford said slowly, by working to change it from within. By remembering what we learned, by treating our own crew with more dignity, more justice, by being the kind of officers who prove that democracy and equality are not just pirate dreams, but achievable realities. Thornbury looked at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Perhaps, though it will not be easy. The Admiralty will not thank us for questioning the natural order of things. No, Ashford agreed, but doing what is right rarely earns thanks. Over the following decades, something remarkable began to happen. Ashford kept his copy of the Pirate Constitution, and though he never published it openly, he shared it with select individuals, young officers, progressive thinkers, men who were beginning to question the rigid hierarchies of their age. The ideas it contained, democratic governance, equality regardless of race, compensation for injury, prohibition of tyranny, these concepts began appearing in political discussions throughout the American colonies and Europe. Historians would later debate the connection, unable to prove direct influence, but noting the suspicious similarity between pirate articles and the democratic principles that would soon explode across the Western world. In 1776, 55 years after the execution of Samuel Bellamy and his crew, 13 American colonies declared their independence from Britain, founding their nation on principles that would have looked remarkably familiar to the pirates of the Libertas. That all men are created equal, that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed, that tyranny must be resisted. Lieutenant Richard Ashford, by then an elderly admiral himself, read the Declaration of Independence with tears in his eyes, recognizing echoes of words he had first encountered on a pirate ship decades earlier. Captain William Thornbury had died 10 years prior, but not before he had transformed himself into one of the most progressive officers in the Royal Navy, known for treating his crews with unprecedented fairness and respect. On his deathbed, he had confessed to Ashford that he had never stopped thinking about that pirate constitution, never stopped wondering what the world might have been like if men like Bellamy had been given the chance to lead nations instead of being hanged as criminals. The British Empire would continue for another 2 centuries, but the seeds of its eventual democratization had been planted, paradoxically, by men it had condemned as the enemies of civilization. Today, in the 21st century, the principles that pirate crews practiced in the 1700s, democratic governance, equality before the law, compensation for injury, prohibition of tyranny, are recognized as fundamental human rights in most of the world. Historians now acknowledge that pirate ships were among the first democratic societies in the modern Western world, sometimes decades ahead of the nations that hunted them. The Constitution of the Libertas was never officially published. Ashford's copy was lost to time, possibly destroyed deliberately by a naval establishment still uncomfortable with its implications. But the ideas it contained could not be destroyed. They spread like wildfire through a world that was ready to burn down old hierarchies and build something new. Samuel Bellamy and his crew died at the end of British ropes in Port Royal, Jamaica, on September 4, 1721. But the society they built, the principles they lived by, the radical notion that common men could govern themselves with justice and dignity, these things lived on. They became, eventually, the foundation of modern democracy. The British captains who couldn't believe pirates had written constitutions were right to be afraid. Not of pirate cannons or stolen gold, but of pirate ideas, ideas powerful enough to reshape the world. And in the end, those ideas proved more formidable than all of His Majesty's ships combined.